Out, so to speak.
There we go, we're live.
Good.
I don't see anyone joining yet.
No, we'll start up. We're on.
Okay.
Wait. One. So the questions are going to go in this panel here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, there's Carol. Hi, Carol. Hi, Sandra.
Hello, Sandra.
I can never find him.
Okay, we're live, so we can hear you, dear Denise. Just so you know, in between expletives. Okay, welcome everybody. We're just coming up to the hour, which is great. Wonderful to have some people back as regular returnees. Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. We're just coming up to the hour, which is great. Wonderful to have some people back as regular. You might have to go somewhere else. Good.
There we go.
Okay. So we've had to move venues today. Our power went out about an hour ago where we live on the farm. And so new challenge. And happily I have a new guest with me today. Dean Howcroft went back to Australia. Happily, he flew out late Saturday night, got in, of course, Monday morning with the dateline and everything else. And he was quite delighted because with some negotiation with the powers that be, he was able to do quarantining at home instead of going to spend 2 weeks in a hotel. So he was quite relieved.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah, great guy. So it's interesting because you've got that miniature door on your head. But everybody has something to bear, I guess. So this is the fifth of these that we've held, and we will continue to hold them for any number of reasons. I've been really pleased with how people have responded and come on and do follow-up. We really like your questions, so keep those happening. If you happen to be in a position and are open to doing so, this might be a time that you could share with some of your group of people. We have shifted to this 1 o'clock time from the 3 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time, partly to kind of reach a compromise. So now this becomes 4 o'clock Eastern Time, which is kind of New York and Toronto, but it becomes, I believe, 9 o'clock in the evening in Britain. And then over in Europe, it would be 10 o'clock. So that's a little more doable, I think, for the Europeans. And we have friends, if you're on, welcome to Mabel and others in the UK. And it's great when other people in other countries, because everybody has a different perspective on this, because it's happening differently across the world, COVID-19. And I think today, Kristina and I will go through that. So my colleague today is a certified nutritionist, and that's Kristina Mitts. And she will be with me the next few times. She's been with us almost 2 years now and has become really very adept and understanding of the microbiome and how it might affect people. She's also aware, as I am, of microbiome treatment when people go to the end stage, which is gut floral transplant, or the old name, which I call old name, which is fecal microbial transplant. It isn't as appropriate because now the implants that we use tend to have all the feces removed. Okay, so you've only got the microbiota, which is, of course, bacteria, fungi, and viruses, of course. And so just as a safety feature, all of the donors that they use in the UK, where the implants come from, for Taymount Canada, for example, are screened for COVID-19 among some of the other dramatic viruses. And that would be hepatitis A, B, and C, and so on. So once again, everyone, welcome. And we want to focus on a couple of things today. One would be the microbiome, of course, and how that's in influence. It's a very big co-infection or synergy, which we've started to learn now. The one advantage, we have today over those that have already been battling heavily against COVID-19 is we have the benefit of their experience. And I think a side comment from that, the more you can, I guess, relatively self-protect yourself from infection, the knowledge base continues to creep up. 2 weeks ago, no one talked about having anything that helped it as far as intervention other than, intravenous vitamin C or oral vitamin C, which we've talked about, of course, before, increased amounts of vitamin D, increased amounts of B vitamins, and making sure that you're getting adequate vitamin A. So maybe I could preface that today after, reviewing all the literature around the world. It's probably still very worth to be on a multivitamin, multimineral. That will have the advantage. That will probably cover enough vitamin A for what you're doing. The other piece, I get part of my vitamin A is I have 2 to 3 eggs every morning. And that, of course, has a number of benefits for the components that it makes for the brain, as well as the healthy cholesterol component, but also the phosphatidylcholine and a decent amount of vitamin A. There's probably, I think, 350 units per egg, so nearly 1,000 in 3 eggs. So each of those is a matter. The other piece I wanted to focus a bit on today, and we'll do it probably a little bit later on, what should you do if you're getting symptoms or think that you may be getting the virus? And I want to give you some helpful hints that I will do in my scenario and you could do in your scenario. Some countries, for example, Germany, when people are diagnosed with it, because they've done a lot of early pre-testing, much like Korea did, so they know that it takes 5 to 7 days to be at its most severe point. So they keep people at home, but they touch base with them very often to see, do they need to get over to hospital because they might need a ventilator? Or do they need to get to hospital for extra oxygen? So we're going to talk about those pieces and how you could do that better at home. So everyone is starting to appreciate, and that's why we're going to spend several sessions on this, because the microbiome is a very new topic to most of you. Not everyone. You're starting to hear about it all the time. I don't think you can hardly pick up a journal article these days that's talking about health and long-term health and chronic health or individual illnesses even, like juvenile rheumatoid arthritis or ulcerative colitis, to find that the microbiome is starting to be considered an important piece. I've talked already about the epigenetics, the ability of us to turn on our good genes and turn off our not so good genes. That's epigenetics. Vitamin D does that for nearly 3,000 genes. I've talked about increased oxygen, which will do it for nearly 8,000 genes. And then by the time you get into the epigenetics of the microbiome, it's probably 15 to 20,000 genes, perhaps all of them. So each of those start to give you an idea about the microbiome. We all have a microbiome. We would not be alive without it. I'm not sure who's sharing with who, but we'll look at it as a synergistic relationship between our microbiome, which is on our skin, of course, and it's all the way from the lips to the bottom end. We often think about it primarily to be based in the large bowel or colon, but of course there's microbiota living all the way down, including the esophagus, including even the stomach and even the duodenum. And it's widespread throughout.
And importantly, the lungs as well, which is coming through in the research from China.
That's right, because the lungs is one of the epicenters, certainly, of this illness. So it's really important. There's nearly about a fifth of people with COVID-19 have a bowel problem, don't they? Mm-hmm. And they have bowel symptoms. And, my friend Rick, he's been through the bowel symptoms. He's getting better, by the way, if anybody's interested. I'm sure Rick is, and his spouse. But everybody kind of gets a different set of symptoms. The ones that happen in the gut are, we know that there's epithelial cells that demonstrate or have ACE2 receptors. So that's angiotensin converting enzyme, but you've heard it talked about because it seems to be one of the things that the virus gains access to the cell with, right? The spikes of the coronavirus go onto the edge of the cell, and they tend to hook on to the actual ACE2 receptor. And the ACE2 receptor is present in the airway, down through the trachea or windpipe, down into the first part of the airway. And so each of those cells will have ACE2 receptors on them. They're also present in the epithelial cells in the stomach, duodenum, and even around the anus, okay? So all of these are ACE2 receptors, and therefore they're also vulnerable to access to the virus. The virus, of course, accesses that point, and then once it's inside the cell, it uses its genetic code system, in this case RNA, not DNA, in the COVID-19 virus, and that reproduces more viruses. So I think, why don't you give a little bit about the story of how we started to learn that it seems to team up with a particular bacteria.
Right. So I think similarly to the analogy with the genetic expression, we have this virus, and the virus only becomes a disease in certain people. And so what we're seeing come through in the research is that one of the things that is making the virus become a disease problem for people is the microbiome. So number one, the week of March 20th, China put out the handbook on COVID prevention and treatment, which included recommendations that had to do with the microbiome itself. And then secondly, there are a number of studies starting to come through on coronavirus patients where we're seeing characteristic differences within the microbiomes, the gut microbiome, as well as the lung microbiomes of these coronavirus patients.
So within that, we know now that certain groups have been affected, and you've heard us talk about that before. Your increased risk if you've got asthma or COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, because that's a challenge to the lungs, and so you're going to be more vulnerable to any pneumonias or anything else, but also the heart diseases and the hypertension and the diabetes mellitus, and now on the list also is obesity or liver disease of a significant amount, or cancers. Each of these, because they have a secondary play in how things affect us and indulge us. The other thing that came out of quite a good paper out of China, and initially I think maybe even a study in Hong Kong, was that they looked very intensively at the microbiome in people, 6 of them within a family and 2 others without, and they found a very strong association. Each of these people had, of course, viruses in place, but they also had a very dominating subset or species within the entire
within the gut ecosystem.
Within the gut and otherwise, but it was an organism which I was not all that familiar with, Prevotella. So Prevotella is, a subset within the species, within the species known. So maybe the analogy I could best use to describe that would be Clostridium. Clostridium difficile, almost everybody knows about. Clostridium tetani, almost everybody knows about because it's a real big illness problem. And yet the majority of Clostridium organisms are not a problem. In fact, they may have beneficial effects. So what you're, I hope, starting to see now is a pattern here, or an awareness. Most bacteria are not bad. Most of them are commensal, meaning they live happily with us. Some of them are parasitic. Some of them are useful in the interaction. For example, at the interface of the linings of the gut with the bloodstream, where the so-called leaky gut syndrome or leaky barrier occurs. That's important due to a commensal teamed up group with bacteria, with our own cells. But the group subset of Prevotella is a particular strain within that species, and the species is called Prevotella bio. Anyway, I'll get to that other name in a minute. It's not critical for you, but Prevotella, when I went further reading, I found a case of a 90-year-old with congestive heart failure was reported in Italy back in September. And this fellow was extremely sick. Once they diagnosed in his blood, because in someone that's really sick, we start to do blood samples to see if there's a recurring blood-borne bacteria, and this, so we call it septicemia. And he did have one, and it was Prevotella. So they treated his Prevotella, which is fairly responsive to many antibiotics. One of the favorites is zithromycin, or in the US, Canada, it's called Zithromax, which is happily, no longer only by one company, meaning it's made generically, so the cost is much less. He was put on, actually in his case, he was put on metronidazole, which you might know better as Flagyl, and it was dramatic. He had a turnaround and was discharged from hospital. I mean, that was in September. I don't know how he did in the later part of the series, because being in 90 with congestive heart failure, he would be a high risk of a subsequent problem with COVID-19 when it came along. But it was my first reckoning with Prevotella. So Prevotella is getting much better understood. And many times it's dominant. It's one of the dominant 3 bacteria groups within the body, correct?
Yeah, you could say that. Mm-hmm.
I guess it's in the Bacteroidetes group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's within the Bacteroidetes phyla. So yeah. I think we could elaborate on that analogy a little more. If you think of, so we have these different groupings or classifications for the microbes that live within our ecosystems. You can think of the overarching family as phyla. So if you think of Bill here, or Dr. Code, he's within the Code family. And within that family, they share certain characteristics. But if you break it down to the individuals within that family, they're not necessarily all going to behave the same, do the same things, or produce the same things. So it's the exact same with our microbes. So we'll have a family, so say the phyla of Bacteroidetes, and then you go down, you become even more and more specific, and not everyone within that family is going to be doing and operating the same way.
Well, that's right. So you start to see the pattern emerging. And, I want to go back to that example I used before, Clostridium. Clostridium is a group, mostly are fine. Clostridium difficile, overdominance, it's a problem. So how do you treat the overdominance? And we know the end stage treatment of overdominance of Clostridium difficile, it's accepted and even approved by the FDA. If it doesn't respond to the pattern of antibiotics, then they treat it with gut floral transplant. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so once one understands that, you want to increase the diversity. So Prevotella can be a problem if it's the only one subset of Prevotella. So to expand on that, Prevotella seems to live very much on starches. And one of the dominant things to boost Prevotella diversity is have a much bigger diversity of starches in our diet. So sure, you can be vegan and this is still a problem for you. So it isn't as simple as that. If I'm vegan, will I be good? Not necessarily the case. You need to have diversity. And so this is why it's been shown a little bit in China and in the United States from work on the microbiome prior, is that there tends to be quite a dominant single grain. The big one is gluten, of course, for many, many of us, and parts of China the same, but also another one fairly dominant in some parts of the world, particularly parts of Asia, is rice. So if you're doing all rice or all gluten or wheat, you're doing
all corn.
Or all corn, you're doing a disservice to the diversity of your microbiome. So I know I've talked before about you might consider eliminating your grains and going heavily to lentils and legumes. And I think you've done some people are starting to shift.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I'm seeing right now, it's like you're saying. So even the vegans and the plant-centric people can end up with this overgrowth of Prevotella. which is not good. But there are benefits from Prevotella as well. So some of the beneficial species of Prevotella will increase our insulin sensitivity. So that's really helpful for us and for the diabetic group. One of the other benefits of some of the Prevotella strains are that they are immunomodulatory, so they can actually be protective in some ways. So we do want to have the Prevotella present, but we want a greater variety of them present. We don't just want one single strain to be present.
And that's the key piece, because just as you say, Prevotella tend to be one of the dominant groups in oral microbiome. So when we have dental abscesses, because this is an anaerobic, meaning it prefers to live without oxygen, okay? As an anaerobic gram-negative entity, it tends to be in dental abscesses, gum disease, and so on. And that's another risk factor, as we all know, for heart disease and other problems cardiovascular-wise, is that subset of bacteria. But you don't want to just do a scorched earth policy in the mouth either. So if you're a regular Listerine user, give it up, please. Yeah. It's about 65% alcohol, and it burns the living daylights out of all the bacteria in your mouth, okay? So if you have some on hand, don't throw it out. It's a good one. Because it's more than 60% alcohol and less than 80 or 90, then it's a good place to clean with your hands when you're out in public or doing what you're doing. But I want you to move away, and we'll spend a whole session focused partly on oral microbiome in the future, but it's not that simplistic. And that's why we used to have a toothpaste called Total. Well, that killed out almost everything as well. It sounded a wonderful idea. And, other people have used chlorhexidine mouthwashes. Bad news, because it takes away all the other. Instead, we want to work on how can we optimize and have a really healthy oral microbiome, because it's the first start. It's on the way in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the issues with Prevotella is that it can so easily translocate from one location to another. It seems to be very flexible. It can adapt to the mouth or oral microbiome. It can adapt to the lung biome, the gut biome, as well as the vaginal biome.
Yeah. So it's virtually everywhere, and that's really adaptable, which is quite an asset. So you would like a bacteria that's very adaptable to be on your side everywhere. So that's why you want variety in it. So maybe if people can use rice one day and flax another, quinoa another.
I would even go, even within those groups, you can create diversity. So have black rice one day, have red rice the next, and then try a whole different grain the next day if you are including grains within your diet.
Yeah. And, boosting your legumes, boosting your lentils, because there's a lot of starches that we get used to. I know in the fall, we will adapt to quite a few different squashes. Mm-hmm. Instead of making pasta, we'll use so-called spaghetti squash. And that allows us to have many of our regular food choices with it as far as sauces and things, but it's a way to blend it around. It's maybe even part of the reason that it becomes obvious if you eat seasonally, you'll keep varying what you eat within your diet. And I know it was interesting with Dean the other day, because we always encourage people to do being 40 to ideally 50 different foods per week. And he was counting his really carefully because he was including spices and different features. He was up to 92, which was terribly impressive, I thought.
Yeah, especially for someone who's early on in the stages of our microbiome restoration program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he adapted quick.
This is a really interesting question from Alexander Rain here. So I thought the COVID virus was both a bacteria and a virus. Is it attacking the gut microbiome, or is the lack of healthy gut bacteria making it challenging to fight it?
So a really good question, because it's because we keep talking about these bacteria, people are starting to think, about maybe using an antibiotic as part of the treatment. So let's differentiate that out. So the virus is very much what COVID-19 or COVID number 2 and is a virus only. However, it's a bit different than some viruses, and it seems to have a team member, in this case the bacterium Prevotella, one particular strain that it seems to hang out with and do extremely well with. So that's the difference here. So we have, to some degree, a co-infection. So the biggest new piece of that is this virus, because Prevotella was around before. And we maybe got away with Prevotella in many cases, all through Canada, United States, other parts of the world. But now we've got one that's teaming up with one particular type of Prevotella. And I would suggest a year from now, we will know as much and have as much passion and interest in Prevotella, especially that strain, as we do with Clostridium difficile. And in fact, Clostridium difficile, other than the, tetanus botulism group, wasn't very well talked about until, I would say, the 1980s. It turned up in the intensive care units in the 1980s. That was when I was training in anesthesiology in Calgary. But typically when someone had a fever of unknown origin, they were desperately sick, we would routinely put them on a triple type of antibiotics so we could cover all the possible bacteria that we might treat. But at the secondary time, many of them got super sick and got, at that time we called it pseudomembranous colitis. And that was a membrane type coating in the large bowel or large colon. And often they had huge fluid problems and went on to die. They didn't always, but the problem was Clostridium difficile. Now we know that Clostridium difficile is endemic. It's in most of our communities, not just in the hospitals, although it's concentrated there a little bit. And it's a high risk game of catching it when you go into hospital, but it's in our communities as well. I would guess 20 or 30%, maybe even higher. And the only reason it doesn't become dominant in those people, they don't have an irritating event. But if they do 2 or 3 courses of antibiotics for some reason, maybe a middle ear infection or maybe a chest infection, boom, they might have a dominance of it because you take away the diverse bacteria to do it. In this way, that's so-called iatrogenic, meaning that the person's causing it. So it's the teaming up of a virus and a bacteria. We haven't talked about that too much. And Prevotella isn't very well known to us, but in this case, it's a particular strain of the Prevotella group. Some of the other bacteria that we're all used to talking about is Staphylococcus, and of course, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. That's the nasty disease that's antibiotic resistant. And so we can touch an important point there, Streptococcus. So when people get this secondary bilateral pneumonia, and it can be very rough, but those at that point will need ventilation, resting, and hopefully recover from that. It's most often a Prevotella organism, but it can be a Streptococcus, Haemophilus, influenza, which are all bacteria groups. Those are the dominant ones we're used to. It's fairly new, in my understanding, for the Prevotella group to be in the so-called pathogenic group. And this goes back a long ways. I mean, this goes back right to germ theory, which I would say has been the dominant part of Western medicine for 150 years since Louis Pasteur described it. But it's stated by some parties on his deathbed, Louis Pasteur gave credence to his competition, which was André Beauchamp. And because he talked about the key piece being the terrain. So the terrain, to my understanding, I mean, you can give me your interpretation next, is that it's the combination of all the bacteria, fungi, and viruses within us, okay? And if they're in good shape, secondarily, our immune system is in good shape, and everything tends to work really fluid together. But if one part gets over-dominant, then it's a problem. And the best way to treat the over-dominance, which is just as we tend to treat people with really tough Clostridium difficile or C. diff, is a gut floral transplant, because it resets the whole marker. Most people may not have to get to that, but they may need to learn all the pieces to increase the diversity so that one spike is no longer a problem. So you improve the terrain. And, so I'll get your comments on that, But my way of thinking of the terrain is eat a very diversified diet, aiming for those 50 foods or more per week.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I love that story about Louis Pasteur. He spent his whole life demonizing bacteria, demonizing the germ, and then finally, by the end of his life, he admits to his colleague, "Oh, actually, I think you're right. It's not the germ; it's the terrain." So within the terrain, I include not just the who, but the what that's there as well. So what are the substrates that they're feeding on? So what's present for them to feed on? What is the pH like? What is the temperature like? And who is their competition? So those are the 4 big ones for me.
Well, that's right. And just as a little sidelight, we often worry about a fever. Okay. And so we reach for, up until now, we often reach for ibuprofen or aspirin or acetaminophen or paracetamol if you're watching from New Zealand or Europe. But we use fever as a way to control an outside influence such as a virus. Okay, so one of the markers, and this is a hint to what I'm going to talk about later, is fevers raised. Okay, and that's our body's effort to counteract viruses. Viruses don't handle heat well. All right, so I would like you to think about, as far as markers, when you've got a significant fever, use 101 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 38.5 Celsius, 38.3, but close enough. That's when you have to start thinking, I've got a fever, maybe this is COVID-19. So what's going with it? And then you still fight the fever, and it's probably still useful to you up to even 103, 104 Celsius, which would be 39.5 or more, roughly, in Fahrenheit. And then maybe you'd consider treating it. But once you're up to that degree, you may need some help in this game. You probably do need some help in this game. And that's when you contact your physician or phone your nurse helpline, whichever the features is, or go to the emergency room. But even that's a challenge in some places, because you can't take it. In certain countries, you can't take a taxi now. You got to get your own transport. And even ambulances aren't keen, because they're going to spend a long time cleaning their machine up to carry you in. So one of the questions come in, and it's come from Luke, and I'm going to address it some, because I tried to say earlier today, I would like you to do the best you can to avoid getting the virus, because we're learning some every week or two, all right? Very dramatically. And we're now accepting, for example, hydroxychloroquine by the FDA, and I think it's being used certainly in a study protocol within Canada. I mean, so hydroxychloroquine is also known as Plaquenil, all right, which we have had for about 75 years, and initially was an anti-malarial drug in the earlier name chloroquine, which is a little bit more tough side effects than is hydroxychloroquine. And it's been used the last 20, 30 years even to help calm down juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and lupus erythematosus. So that's where it came from, and it seems to have some antiviral benefits. And I'll use my friend Rick as an example. He had access to some of that. He started to use it when he got air hunger, chest pain, and his oxygen saturation started to drop. It wasn't enough. He was finally able to access some azithromycin, and things settled down quite a bit better. So that seems to be the pair. It initially, I think, came out of France, using those pair. And of course, the azithromycin is not treating the virus. It's probably helping treat or downplay that co-infection of one of the strains of Prevotella bacteria. Okay, so that's how they work. So those aren't pieces that, people can't go out and buy that in this country or in most countries. They need a physician to do it. And certainly in Canada currently, it's under fairly tight restriction for those, because they're worried they'll run out. but they're being used more and more and more in hospitals throughout the world as one of the possibilities to help keep people away from ventilators or shorten the time with being very sick with the virus. So there's other ones being looked at, and that's why I'm talking about the more you defer, the more that the medical people are going to be comfortable with some of these other choices to handle this illness. Happily, they had very good success in China and Japan and South Korea using intravenous vitamin C. And that's starting to get more accepted. I know some of the intensive care units in New York have been using it with good effect because it's a potent, in this case, antiviral. It also seems to help downplay the so-called cytokine storm. So the cytokine storm, those are molecules within the lungs and other parts of the body which can go up really high. So let's talk a bit about how Prevotella fits in, because Prevotella, when it flares and teams up with the virus, it previously was so-called immunomodulatory, but now some strains jack up or increase that cytokine storm, which are molecules which dramatically increase the inflammation. So the dramatic increase in inflammation helps you understand what's going wrong when the lungs get really bad in a hurry. Because part of inflammation, of course, is extra fluid, okay, or swelling. If you had a bruised knuckle, it would be swollen, it would be red hot, it would be loss of function, and so on, the 4 steps. So those aren't available for everyone. They probably shouldn't be used until you're in a major stage of the illness. It's the wrong thing to reach for prophylactically, because then it may not work when you need it, when you get really sick. So ideally it would be used in someone who's got the diagnosis. Now, even the diagnosis is varied around the world. Germany's really been quite aggressive in trying to diagnose as many people as they can. South Korea did the same, because that changes your energies. I think the global suggestion was, don't investigate everyone, because it saves resources, right? But the downside of that is, once you've got a diagnosis, even if they're young, healthy, and no symptoms, then they're smart enough and they know they need to go into relative quarantine to protect everybody else. And that's what really matters. So I'm already kind of started about the symptoms of it. So that's one of the major symptoms, of course, is the fever, the sore throat, because it tends to start up in the upper or oral microbiome, in the sinuses. You have sinusitis in the mouth and the sore throat. And then over several days, it seems to migrate down the windpipe, trachea, and into the lungs. That's the typical manner, although in some people, maybe 1/5, it also goes into the gut. So they may have abdominal pains, they may have diarrhea, and that is how it affects the other system, because remember, that can affect the epithelial cells, which are also present in the stomach, duodenum, and around the rectum. Mm-hmm. So the other feature that I want people to think about and have, and this is maybe, so you've already figured out, you better have a thermometer. I think that's a very good idea. Have a thermometer. I would suggest the other thing to have, especially if you've got one of the risk factors or several of the risk factors, I would suggest is a pulse oximeter. And I'll have one with me on Thursday, but you put it on your fingertip, you've all seen them, and it gives you a readout of your oxygen saturation, and it gives you a readout of your pulse. So if you put that on, ideally you would have one now when you're normal. So do it when you're sitting or standing, and do it also when you're laying flat, because it usually goes down some. I've talked a bit about this before, because you don't get the optimal gas perfusion exchange when you're laying flat, because the abdominal contents push up against the diaphragm and things don't work as good. But if you've got that baseline reading ahead of time, then you know when you're starting to change. So if you're getting short of breath, your pulse oximeter is now reading below, say, 90, time to get off to the emergency room. Or if you're lucky enough to have an oxygen concentrator at home, you may be able to buy time and you may be able to write it out at home. But you better have the pulse oximeter as an optimal treatment modality to tell you, because I don't think all countries are going to do the same as they do in Germany, where they've got people checking in on you all the time. It takes too long to get that big a change happening. And currently, I know what we do in our part of the country is we phone the nurse helpline to get an idea of what we should do. But I would urge you, because if things get really busy, it's going to be tricky to get in touch with the helpline.
Definitely.
So those are the steps that I want you to do, and you can protect yourself to some degree getting a pulse oximeter, oxygen saturation monitor. They're usually $50 to $100. They're not expensive. They will become in short demand, I would suggest, very soon. But I think it's a wise thing to do because it really lets you understand that. The oxygen concentrators, they're getting hard to find. Some people have suggested to me, that people could get those small oxygen tanks that you can use to recover from your heavy duty workout. The tricky part about those, they don't last very long. They probably last less than half an hour. So that isn't going to buy you enough time. Because when my friend Rick, he was on an oxygen concentrator, he was using about a third of the day. And I said, no, you want to use it all the day long. Because he was probably with it getting something like 28 to 30% oxygen, which is a significant boost. I mean, I refer back to Dr. John West's article on lung breathing. If they put 28% oxygen, this is particularly in people that are living at altitude, so 3,000 meters or a mile high, then if they put 28% oxygen in the high school room, everybody performed better academically. So it's the same things that optimize the brain function. We want to optimize the breathing and the lung, because one of the trigger factors also for that cytokine storm or that huge boost in inflammation is hypoxia, lack of oxygen. And you can see how it might be happening because the airways are getting swollen. They're moving air less well. A parallel example would be the asthma patient. They can't get the air in optimally, and all of a sudden now the oxygen is dropping below healthy levels, and that also triggers inflammation. So the two in combination, cytokine storm, very sick, in a very big hurry. Acute respiratory distress syndrome. Are we at 1 hour now?
Oh no, we're at 42 minutes.
Okay, good. Just to keep it straight. So I think I got diverged there, but I was trying to give people an idea what they should be doing and how they can protect themselves somewhat better to know what they're doing at home. And lots of people now will use a pulse oximeter as an indication of how well your lungs are functioning and when you might need help. And I think it's a good, useful piece to try and work that forward.
Definitely.
Do you know what your saturation is? Have you tried it?
No,
Tried
I have
one?
not.
Okay. Well, we'll do it online.
Okay.
Because I expect yours is really quite good. You're not a smoker. You don't have asthma. It's all good. Okay. So what other pieces are we missing on the microbiome discussion that people can start to work on themselves?
Right. Well, to take it back to the key findings with the studies that are coming out on coronavirus patients. So number one, we're seeing a lack of diversity within these patients, within their gut ecosystems, as well as the lungs. We are seeing a lack of bifidobacteria, which are beneficial microbes, incredibly important to us. And we're seeing an overgrowth of, even beyond just the Prevotella, other pathogenic species as well, whether or not they are being infiltrated by the virus. So we can work on the diversity piece by including at least 40 or 50 different foods per week within our diet. So the wider the variety of foods we feed our microbes, the more the ecosystem is going to grow and the more diverse it's going to become. So really, it's them that keeps each other in check. The microbes do use chemicals to speak to each other, and the more diverse the environment is, the more they keep themselves in check. So they are self-regulating if the ecosystem is harmonious.
Yeah.
Number 2 would be to boost the bifidobacteria. So interestingly enough, if we compare the microbiomes of, say, Japan, where they have a really low fatality to infection rate compared with countries like China or Italy, for example, we see that Japan has really high levels of bifidobacteria, in some cases 20% more than China or the US. So I think we'd be doing ourselves a favor, definitely, if we were to work on increasing bifidobacteria. And the types of things that bifidobacteria love are legumes. They also love certain fruits like pomegranate, and they like nopal. They also like yam. So those are all pretty good things that you can incorporate into your diet to increase your bifidobacteria.
And that was one of the pieces I had to go look it up because I didn't know what Nepal was, but to me, it's prickly pear cactus.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, because so that's a particular part, and I learned in my integrative medicine because I took it down in the 1 week per year was down in Tucson. Well, with lots of prickly pear cactus in that part of the world, and it was a very major part of the Native American indigenous population's food cycle, especially in the times that it was in that wonderful red fruit. But we don't see it much here. Is it available in our stores?
I've seen it occasionally in the Asian supermarkets here.
Okay, sure.
But you can also get it as a powder. It's pretty easy just to purchase on Amazon. You get nopal powder.
Yeah, Nopal. So it's not overly expensive because it grows really well in some parts of the world. Although, they've got a domestic group which doesn't have the spines on it because the spines are a bit tricky to deal with. And if you're eating it and get some of the little spines caught in your mouth and so on, then you're into infection problems and all kinds of difficulties. So in this time, it's been carefully bred, so the spines are in it. We used to raise blackberries, and we used to have an Oregon strain, which was thornless, which was awesome. A lot nicer to work with and work with because the spines are the protective part of the plant. But of course, if you're growing it domestically, you can breed it slowly, so it's without that. It's like growing beef without horns. That eventually would become a very dominant thing, and that's less injury for the animals and everything else.
Good.
Yeah.
I think that all of that being said, the translocation as well is something that I keep coming back to. So the fact that we have Prevotella in our mouths, especially if you're experiencing imbalance within that oral microbiome. So how can you take care of your oral health better? I mean, it's common sense, brush your teeth and floss your teeth twice a day. That would be the most basic recommendation. And then the next step from there to try to prevent the GI symptoms from occurring with this virus, in my mind, I go to getting off of the antacids and the PPIs if you can, because if you lower your stomach acid, then you've lost that protection. So that's your first step of protection from bacteria coming in from your mouth, from food, and from water, is that acid that's in your stomach. And when you take something like antacids or PPIs, you're having a lowering of that acid, and then you have these microbes that can make it from your mouth or your food or your water all the way into your intestines.
So let's just spend a moment on that. PPI means protein pump inhibitor, okay? So that means that the body is switched off. You're switching off its ability to make acid or hydrochloric acid, okay? Protein pump makes hydrochloric acid. So it inhibits the protein pump inhibitors. There's a list of about 5 of them. It always stresses me. It's one of the questions. It's one of the chapters I put in my book, Solving the Brain Puzzle. Definitely think about if you can taper off your protein pump inhibitor, and I give you tips on how to do that as well. But the more you increase the diversity of your microbiome, it's curious because it solves the problem of the heartburn and all the reason you were taking in the first place. Because many people are put on it, and even if you read the fine print when you get it, 3 months is how long you're supposed to be on it. But I've seen people on it for a decade or longer. Or they've tried to go off it because they're conscientious, they want to get off it, can't get off it. Well, not surprisingly, it comes in one size. You skip a day, boom, you get a rebound, you get more problems. So it's like many medications, and the point of return people help teach us that you've got to taper it off gradually. So I talk about switching over gradually to, for example, ranitidine, which is getting a lot of negative press lately because of components within it, not the ranitidine itself, and then you can taper off much more gradually. At the same time, you're improving your diet and your microbiome. So you're really bringing up, for example, your probiotics, maybe even your prebiotics. There's a few prebiotics dramatically help us boost our bifidus. And we'll make a point. We'll mention those. We're not going to say them all online today, but we'll mention from the paper that you start to prepare. We'll put that on my website, drbillcode.com, so then you can find some of the suggested things that will boost the bifidus. We haven't said it today, but you want to have more of those fermented products. I'm sorry, I don't mean beer and wine here, as pleasing as those might be, but the alcohol is kind of a negative feature on the well-being of the microbiome. Not surprisingly, alcohol is tragically injurious to some species. No, I mean fermented things like, and I'll forget some, so fill in yogurt, whether it's made from dairy or coconut, kefir, kombucha, sauerkraut, kimchi. I missed some more.
Beet kvass is the only other one I can think of.
Okay, yeah. And there is subtle ones in everyone's diet. I mean, and you've got the ones in Japan that are made from soy products, right? Miso soup and so on.
Exactly. I think that's another piece to why the Japanese are responding so differently to the virus as well, is that they consume so much fermented soy, and especially natto, which is shown to boost bifidobacteria.
Yeah. So that's one way. And the other thing, I was over visiting my son. It's probably 20 years ago now in Japan. He'd set up a luncheon for a businessman. We were talking about a particular thing around emus, and I counted them. There was 28 different vegetables on the lunch tray. And I would defy anyone to find 28 different vegetables on a lunch tray here in Canada, United States. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen much in Europe. We've been lucky enough to travel a fair bit. You don't see it very often. So they're eating that huge diversity in their diet, and they're sort of doing really well.
Yeah. Just to backtrack a little bit, back to the PPIs thing, I know we've seen some really tricky clients at our clinic who have needed to come off of PPIs, but it's not always that straightforward. So if you are having trouble getting off the PPIs, it's usually because they've been masking some underlying problem. So you may need to look to, okay, do I have any food intolerances or food sensitivities? Do I have SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth? And that's something we'll address in a future Facebook Live, and then also bile acid reflux. So these are all things you can talk to your healthcare provider about if you're having trouble getting off of your PPIs.
And I'll be honest with you too, as a healthcare provider, 4 years ago, I hadn't heard of SIBO. Well, probably 2 years I hadn't heard of it. Well, 2 years I maybe had, but just. And, I'm lucky enough to go to a lot of different conferences. I follow very much the integrative medicine, functional medicine path. So those people are much better informed on it. I know gastroenterologists here in this part of Canada, they're starting to become pretty aware of SIBO. But if you go to the rank and file practitioner, most of them won't know about it yet. So it's a very important entity. We need to figure out if people have it, because it's reasonably treatable. And it's again with how you're controlling your diet and how you're making a difference to it. And it goes away to some of the patterns that we used to. We used to encourage people frequent small eatings, grazing. Well, that's not ideal. If you've got SIBO, it's less than optimal because you're trying to increase it. So anyway, we'll go into that in a future meeting. And I think that's a pretty enlightening topic for people as well, because that might be what's holding them up, giving them the heartburn, the indigestion, the burping, all those other potential problems, plus or minus diarrhea or plus or minus constipation. And they're different in that group. It seems to be. Yeah.
Yeah, and then secondly, with the bacterial translocation, I'm sure a ton of you are already off the PPIs, off the antacids. You already know this, but you can still help prevent that translocation from the mouth to the intestines by working on increasing your stomach acid production. So as we age and the more stress we're under, we have less and less production of this stomach acid. So there are things you can do to help support that production. You can try sipping on lemon water before you consume your meals. You can take a little bit of apple cider vinegar diluted with water before your meals, or you can take certain supplements. So like Swedish bitters is a really good one, or you can actually supplement with the HCl itself.
Yeah, you were going to say papain?
Yeah.
Yeah, digestive component, that's pineapple origin, but it helps the digestive process. Or, betaine, and in probably 40 years ago, it wasn't uncommon that doctors prescribed hydrochloric acid drops, okay, which increased acidity. So now we tend to do that in, I think it's betaine. You'll find that in some of your digestive enzyme combinations. Digestive enzymes can be reasonably helpful in that sort of way and help you digest your foods, which prepares it better. So now it's a better, more complete, better set of choices for the bacteria as we get down further into the gut. So remember, all those bacteria are part of the team helping the digestive process. We don't have quite the pathway that the four-stomach type ruminant of the cow or sheep, in that we don't get to digest cellulose as much, but there's a lot of things that we can digest better because we've got the team players with us, the bacteria. Even the features like Candida, which is a fungi, of course, and the other fungi, if they're in modest amounts, they can be all part of the team and part of the diversity. But if one's over the top abnormal, or maybe we're unlucky enough to be living in a water and breakdown building where we've got molds, that's a whole other set of issue. And that's worth probably a talk or two as we try to help people if they're fitting into that group. They've done all the other work, but they still can't get well. Because wellness is a journey. And I think we're learning that very much with COVID-19. The typical thing in medicine, and I've been at it, I guess, 41 years now, we used to say, well, there's health and there's disease, okay? But we realize now that's very much a continuum. So I like to say now there's not using my hands very well, optimal health, which is what we want to strive for. And then if you lose optimal health long enough, you end up with disease, okay? And you don't want to be over there because it's a long journey back. And you'll have to change those pieces as you journey back and get them all more complete. But it was Hippocrates said, a very long time ago, so-called father of medicine from Greece, if you get the gut well, if you get the gut healthy, the body will be healthy. And it's very much true today. And that's why we need the help of the gut, getting the gut well, optimized with that microbial diversity, microbial meaning virus, fungi, and bacteria. If we get them well, then we're going to be much more capable of dealing with the problem of the COVID-19 virus, okay? Because it can't have its number one team player working with it, that nasty subset group of Prevotella.
Mm-hmm. And I think as well, something else to consider would be the health of the membranes and the barriers between the different locations. So our barriers maintain their flexibility with omega-3s. So can you include more omega-3 fatty acids in your diet from eating seafood, for example, or clams or scallops or squid? Those are all really good sources of omega-3. And then on the vegetarian side, walnuts, hemp, flax, that type of thing.
Yeah, and the challenge, remember, and I talk about that in the book, because of course, not all of us convert the basic omega-3, which is alpha-linolenic acid, down to the EPA and DHA, which is the parts that help build the brain, but also the cell membranes throughout the body, okay? So it really matters, and it's a matter of getting that optimized. And if you don't happen to be in that group, and you're higher at risk for not transferring across, if you're a woman who's now postmenopausal, because nature has a very protective mechanism, women that are in the reproductive stage group are better able to convert the basic omega-3, in flax oil and so on, down to EPA DHA, whereas men will convert 0 or 12%. Now, I can't tell if you're a 0 or a 12, and no one can unless you spend a lot of money measuring it. So better in those cases to take the EPA and the DHA.
Mm-hmm. And that's going to be really helpful for reducing inflammation as well. Some other nutrients to consider for maintaining the gut barrier homeostasis and making sure that that stays healthy would be zinc. And I'd also include vitamins A and D and C.
Yeah. So one way to get the adequate A is probably that multivitamin, multimineral, okay? And if that isn't enough, you can bump up some A with eggs and so on. So we've got one other question I think we'll take. It's from Shanine, talking about the use of quinine and tonic, and water will help. Not dramatically so. The quinine probably is the forerunner to chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. So I think it's very early days to take it that extra leap and say that it will help. There was days, and that's probably why the gin and tonic developed so well with the English people over in India, because there seemed to be some benefit from the quinine component, but it's not so much now. Most of our things are just quinine flavored, and including our tonic water, so we're not getting very much benefit out of those. So I think the other ones we want to look at there.
From Suzanne, how long does it take to rid the biome from these strains that are present on grains? Well, you're not going to be rid of them entirely.
You don't want to.
It also depends completely on your diet. So like we mentioned, the Prevotella proliferates when it's fed starches, especially those from grains. So the more grains you feed them, the more Prevotella you're going to have. But we also mentioned that you want to have Prevotella. So there are some Prevotella strains that are helpful for you. It's just when you have one or maybe two strains of Prevotella that become overgrown. So you want them to have competition within their own families. So plenty of Prevotella species to keep each other in check, but then competition between Prevotella and other types of bacteria as well. And the number one way you do that is by having a diverse diet.
Yeah, and you can make a lot of difference even in a week or two. So another secondary reason, if you're needing to make these adjustments in your diet, so you're going to be going off the SAD or Standard American Diet, trust me, you need to make it much more diverse. So you can't do a hamburger 12 times a week. It doesn't cut it for all the grain issues and so on, because it's always a single grain. So you can make a lot of adjustments in a week or two. So every time you're doing that, you're modulating and optimizing your own personal immune system, making it more ready to cover the problem. So I think that brings us to a close, pretty close. Once again, we're going to take these and put them onto a YouTube, and they'll be on my website, drbillcode.com, because I'm not naive enough to think that the whole world is on Facebook. Now, many of you are, and I thank you for watching. In addition, we're going to put on the website a paper from today talking about some of the probiotics that you might use from specific companies and these sorts of issues. Upcoming meetings, I think on Thursday, we'll again go over what you should optimize with your own possibility of developing COVID-19, but also keep on all the features that you're doing that you've learned about already. You know, that hand washing and the whole deal, the physical distancing. I like physical distancing better than social distancing because we still need to interact with each other. And so if you can't do that, then, pick up the phone to your friend or all those other variations of communication, because loneliness is a big risk factor. Mm-hmm. If you're lonely, especially if you're on your own, if you're lonely, it's the same as 15 cigarettes a day. So that's not good for us. Mm-hmm. And the same is, if you're a couple stuck in a small apartment, figure out some way to increase the interaction between yourselves and outside, whether it's on the phone or a communication via your computer. You've got to keep that mix up, or the stress builds between the two of you. And just as we're saying that child abuse and wife abuse is increasing these days because people are stuck intimately together. So we've got to look at more and more options to try and diffuse those crises and keep people well, because it keeps them well, but it also has none of the downsides. So thanks very much for watching. Thanks for joining me today, Kristina. We'll look forward to doing things again on Thursday, 1 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time. And the topic will be more on the microbiome in detail, the oral microbiome, and then other features that are coming to the fore. And we'll take it from there. Thanks again. Send those questions in if you want to.
Yes, and we'd love it if you would share the video as well. So we're putting out these free Facebook Lives for everyone. It would definitely help if you could share them to as many people within your circles as possible to help us extend our reach. So thanks so much.